I really appreciate your invitation for me to be here and to listen in on that. It's exciting and echoes a lot of the experiences that I've had over the years. It was obvious from the discussion this morning, each of us in this room knows that there's nothing easy about city building. There is no formula, no playbook, no toolkit, no model that guarantees success. As many of you noted, your cities are at different points on the trajectory. You have different political and social and economic climates, and so that calls for different responses. Nonetheless, I think there's a lot that you can learn from each other and I can learn from you. So I feel pretty modest about the invitation to share with you some perspective on how to build public-private partnerships that lead to successful cities. Again, you're doing it, and again, you've shared that experience with one another today. You know, I've worked, as Lauren said, in lots of different cities, and now I'm back in my hometown of Memphis, working on a partnership that is, partnerships are hard, and I loved who said when the public shows up, it's usually with negative comments, right? Yeah, so we've all been there, but I work in a city that is a majority black city and a majority black county in a metro area that is where the largest demographic is African American. So it is a city that is culturally really rich, but it is challenged by its demography, and it's challenged by the questions of the questions and the issues of race and racism that still underpin life in America. So it's a city that is very much challenged, and so I appreciate the challenges that you face in your own city. I also think challenged cities are the most interesting places to work. I can't think of a more worthy cause than to be involved in the real life, the battlefield of a city that is challenged. And I want to talk about that a little bit today. Your cities are challenged, my city's challenged. I don't know a city that isn't challenged in some way. But sometimes, and on some days, the challenges our cities face look insurmountable. But those of us who are committed to our communities, who are place-based, who are fundamentally local, like many of you are, and certainly like I am, we don't have the luxury of accepting that our city's problems are insurmountable. We have to persist. In fact, we have to do more than persist. We have to succeed. So what do we do? Where do we find and equip civic leaders? What a great conversation you had on that this morning, talking about how you engage and train up young leaders in communities. What are the mechanisms, the structures that will give civic leaders the best chance to succeed? I loved the notion of how do you form organizations, partnerships that persist and exist and can hold the vision for a community, can create the continuity over time to think bigger, broader, longer. I loved that comment. How do we know which civic and economic models are best suited to where our communities are today on the trajectory, and even what success looks like? I think that is very much at issue today in America's communities. What does success look like? There was a comment about, we wouldn't let the self-storage unit go in, and yet that's real estate development, that's growth, that's business, is that what success looks like today? So even the question of what success looks like, to me, it is very much in contention. And one of the things Lauren said, when I was at Art Place, we made an investment in this network. It's one of the things I've admired from the beginning of this initiative is your willingness to act out of abundance and to share lessons with one another, to see yourselves as allies and in alliance with the state's largest city is a too rare occurrence. We don't see that much around the country. I've always thought you've created what is a brilliant, effective model for other states, and lots of other states ought to be copying it. You talked about this morning, finding and equipping the kinds of civic leaders able to pull this off is unusual, and it's not an easy task today. And when I say civic, I mean the people, no matter what their day jobs are engaged in the work of carrying communities forward. It's the work that often sits in the in-between spaces and across sectors, work that is often tackled through partnerships, through public-private partnerships. Now, I've been involved in public-private partnerships for a very long time, probably the 70s. I know the 70s. I hate to admit that, but okay. Since the 70s, first locally, and then in a lot of cities around the country. And, in the 70s, civic leadership was pretty easy to source. Leaders typically were CEOs of the foundational local businesses, the local banks, the hospitals, the department stores, the local utility, the local newspaper publisher, maybe the big local manufacturing plant exec. And these local businessmen, and they were usually businessmen, could reliably speak with one voice on the city's civic and economic development priorities. They were usually organized under the banner of a CEO's council or some similar business group, and occasionally they formed groups that included a few token others. They looked around the room and they said, well, maybe we need somebody of color, somebody, who's not male, and so we'll add a minister, or maybe we'll add a college president, but just to get a little diversity in the room. But civic leadership, what was that, 40, 50? That can't be right. A long time ago, was decidedly white. It was male, and it functioned top down. So now, as you've said today, civic leadership is a lot more diverse, which makes it a lot more complex, a lot harder to source. It's a lot harder to organize. It's not necessarily positional. I loved, again, the comment of how does civic leadership go grab those smart, agile, creative people into the mix to create a sort of a stronger vision and a more imaginative vision given where we are today. And you know this, in the face of a dramatically changing economy, many of the old sources of civic leadership just simply dried up. So what do we do when the CEOs of the local businesses are no longer local? Is the only alternative to work bottom up? Well, I don't think so. I don't think the opposite or the answer to can't work completely top down is to work completely bottom up. I think we still need leadership. Civic leadership still needs a home. You talked about that today. Some sort of structure, some sort of support, again, that can hold that community vision over time that was said this morning. And civic leadership still relies on trust relationships that come together from working over time. Again, there was this conversation about, do we need short-term wins so that we can begin to build the trust, right? Change works at the speed of trust. I think that's true, and it's the reason those small wins matter. A long time ago, I had the opportunity to run CEOs for Cities, an organization that Paul Grogan founded. It was a national network of urban leaders who were working to make their cities successful. It feels like it's gateway cities, but at scale. And in its early years, CEOs for Cities, Lauren, you remember this, required the member cities to bring leaders in 3 positions. It was the corporate CEO, the mayor, and the university president. But by about year 3 or 4, we'd thrown that model out and said, look, leadership, civic leadership can come from anywhere. Let's not be so prescriptive about where civic leadership must come from. And what we found over the years is that we began to get much more diversity in terms of who showed up and what we wanted to do, particularly in mid-sized cities, was to make sure that they could bring all of their talent to the table, to find those creative creative people who may have a different version of the future and could infuse that thinking into what could be a little old school. I mean, especially in smaller cities, especially in mid-sized cities. We can afford to leave no talent behind. We have to, and no asset behind. We have to develop we have to recognize all of our talent, develop all of our talent, and put all of our talent to work. Having said that, it's always easier to make progress when you have the right people in the right chairs. There's no doubt about it. You can waste a lot of time, you know this, working around the problem people or the non-believers, if you will, but we don't always have the luxury of having the right people in the right chairs, the believers. And so I think, again, we can't afford to wait. We can't afford not to do something because, you know, it's like waiting forever to get the right people. So we have to work with the talent we have and persist. When I ran the Mayor's Institute on City Design, and more recently, an initiative called Reimagining Civic Commons, I learned that sometimes people are willing to lead, but they're not quite prepared to lead. Someone talked today about city councils not quite having the information they need to be good partners in the work you want to do. And when people aren't prepared, they're not as ambitious as they need to be to carry challenged communities forward. That's why I think this network is so important. It's so valuable because it produces new knowledge that can be shared among you as participating cities. It generates stories from leaders on the front lines of change, and it develops new playbooks for what works and what doesn't. It also, again, the research, new knowledge is so utterly important. And all of that fortifies ambition for our cities. And oh, do we need it. You know what your cities are facing today. We're living in a winner-take-all economy where big is getting bigger and rich are getting richer, and the middle, in a lot of cases, is disappearing. And I think that's not just a description of individuals or economic classes or companies, it is also a description of cities. And that's what makes the cities in this room and mine so utterly challenged. Now, we have a lot of experience in America with shrinking cities. First, it was rural America, then it was manufacturing America, and you would think that with so much practice, we would have ready responses to those kinds of challenges. But you know, the so-called experts, the economists in particular, admit they are completely flummoxed by what's going on and mainly how to respond, how you and I can respond to the challenges in our communities. As Nobel prize-winning economist and New York Times columnist Paul Krugman explains it, innovative companies choose to locate where other successful innovative companies are. That's where they find lots of skilled workers. The more densely packed these pools of talent are, the more workers can learn from each other and the more productive they become. This dynamic feeds on itself, drawing more high-tech firms and highly skilled workers to where they already are. Economists are saying the reality of agglomeration is inescapable. And it is one of those powerful forces shaping our economy today. It has been over the last 30 years, and they see no change in sight. Mark Moreau at Brookings Institute described the trend as a spatial reorganization of the economy. He says, we have an archipelago of superstars in an ocean of low productivity sectors. He could have substituted sectors. He could have substituted cities for sectors. Harvard economist Ed Glaeser, some of you may remember this, he once told the people of Buffalo the solution to their problem was just move. That we need people-based strategy, not place-based strategy, because Buffalo has been unable to reinvent itself in the ways Boston and Minneapolis have done. Like Krugman and many economists, Glaeser believes the key ingredient in a city's success is human capital. He wrote, the cities that bounced back did so thanks to smart entrepreneurs who figured out new ways for their cities to thrive. The share of the population possessing college degrees in the 70s is the best predictor of cities that have done well since then. After he told the people of Boston, well, he didn't tell them, he wrote about them in a very public publication. So they invited him to town, which I thought was just a lot of chutzpah, to explain this to them. And so they wanted him to come to Buffalo and reconsider his move strategy. And thereafter, he concluded, well, the best scenario would be for Buffalo to become a much smaller but more vibrant community, shrinking to greatness, in effect. I thought that was an interesting pivot on Ed's part. Krugman's advice was to get real about the powerful forces behind the economic decline of small-town America, saying nobody really knows how to reverse those forces. So, it may be presumptuous, but I want to push back on all of those distinguished economists. Let me first concede, I think they are absolutely correct when they tell us college degrees matter to a city's success. As Ed Glaeser says, at the local level, the most important economic development strategy is to attract and train smart people. But if you train smart people and they leave you, right, then you've done the expensive part of the work and some other city benefits. So therein lies the dilemma. And further, Glaeser had said, cities need smart entrepreneurs who can figure out new ways for their cities to thrive, and that also matters. By the way, that's you. You are the smart entrepreneurs who have to figure out how your cities thrive. But those same economists seem to believe there is no real path to success for smaller cities. You don't believe that, or you wouldn't be doing the work you're doing, and I don't believe that because otherwise I would not be doing the work I'm doing. I believe these economists underestimate you and your cities. They underestimate the appeal of livable places. They underestimate things not easily measured, and they underestimate the power of networks like this one. It's getting harder to ignore the pressure of rising home prices and increasing traffic in fast-growing cities. At the same time, it's getting harder to build new housing and new transit in fast-growing cities. In other words, livability is being challenged in fast-growing cities, and it's getting worse. Those challenges are getting greater. And we can all point to cities that have rejected new transit, rejected new housing. It happens every single day in San Francisco and Boston. I know that's one of the things Ed Glaeser has fussed about for years about Boston, not being willing to build more housing. So that opens up, I think, an interesting pathway to smaller cities. I believe there's a strategy for smaller cities to compete on livability. as Glazer said to Buffalo, shrink, become much smaller, but more vibrant. And the question, I would add, become more vibrant, become greener, become more compact, become more pedestrian friendly, more beautiful, more convivial, more joyful. Those are things that are not easily measured, but your cities are in very good positions to deliver on those aspects of quality of life that you should not discard. And not only not discard, you need to think very intentionally about those things. How would you deliver? Can you make it easier for people to connect with each other, with the closest big city, and with the world? There are lots of ways to do that today that we still don't take advantage of. We don't make easily available. Can you make it easy for people to live complete lives? Combinations of fast and slow, city and nature. People today are spending more on services than they are on goods. Experience matters more than stuff. And you see that in the increase in restaurant workers, for instance, today, and the decline in retail workers. So experience matters. Experience is frequently, services are frequently made and delivered locally. So that's something you can do, and you can compete there in ways that I think that we've not always recognized and certainly not always managed. Think of your city as an experience. Do whatever you have to do to encourage people to get more education and more qualifications. Do a superior job of welcoming people to your community, including visitors, and integrating them as quickly as possible. Again, leave no talent behind, if you will. Invite people to participate. I know that sounds so obvious, but do we do it? Invite people to participate in all kinds of ways. I loved, again, the young leadership notation earlier. And stay in touch with natives that, in fact, move away, because they're the most likely people to move back for family reasons, familiarity, all kinds of friendships. And I believe very much in the ability of engaging people in partial ways. Very few cities do this. But if there are people who have a connection to your cities, they don't live there today, but they have some connection. See if you can't tap them in some way. Can they sit on a board that meets 4 times a year that will allow participation via video conference? That, if they participate, then they give. The more connected they are, the more likely they will invest, including move back. You may have seen there's a recent piece I think it was in the New York Times, I know it was in the Times, I think it was in the magazine, by a woman named Michelle Anderson. She returned to her hometown of Fergus Falls, Minnesota. It was titled, "Go Home to Your Dying Hometown." And she wrote, "I did, and it isn't what I expected. I am more involved in social and racial justice, economic development, and feminism than I ever was in a big city." Her life there gave her access, and it gave her time to be engaged in those things. There's great appeal to being involved and being needed. Last week I was on a panel at the Milken Institute's Global Conference with Dan Buettner, who is the author of Blue Zones of Happiness. Are any of you familiar with the Blue Zones work? It's really interesting. If you're not, you should look it up online, even if you don't buy the book. Our topic for this panel was the city for all ages, harnessing the promise of longevity. Now, I started thinking, now, why did you invite me? But then I, quickly realized there was a reason. But with the huge boomer population aging so quickly and trying to figure out how to age gracefully, making your city a blue zone where healthy living is the easy choice seems like a smart investment in livability. small and mid-sized cities, especially those who have experienced population or job loss, or those that are still too black for a racist America like mine, suffer from compromised narratives. We need something in our cities that captures the imagination, something that alters the narrative of the city, something sufficiently different from every other city. As the great urbanist James Jacobs told us, the greatest asset a city can have is something that is different from every other place. And I was at Mass MoCA this weekend, and I think that's an example of that. It generates positive and constant media attention. It attracts visitors to North Adams. It improves livability for locals, increases the consumer choices, and conveys status on the people who live there. I was thinking about, of all places, Waco, Texas, a city that was sort of for the longest time thought of as the place where there were a lot of really tragic and wacky mass shootings. And I was thinking the change in the image of Waco due to Chip and Joanna Gaines. Now, all the women are nodding. Yeah, we got Chip and Joanna. And for those of you who don't know, Chip and Joanna are the host of Fixer Upper. Very popular TV program that has now they're going to have their own channel. They're so successful. And they have this magazine called, Magnolia? Yeah, there you go. And they got the Magnolia Silos. Basically, Waco, Texas is now, has been redefined by this brand of the Gaines. And who knew, right? So you went from Waco equals mass shootings to Waco equals fixer-uppers in Magnolia and Chip and Joanna. Really great example. Closer to home, I think Lowell's milk conversion early created a national kind of buzz and reputation about that city. So, your move doesn't have to be as dramatic as any of that. Maybe you don't have Chip and Joanna living in your city. Maybe it looks like more like the Northeast First Blue Zone. It's just, just think, how can my city be first, best only on something that matters, something that can capture the broader imagination, something that would-be residents and business leaders will notice, something that adds appeal for existing residents. Many of you in this room, I know, have done business recruiting, and if you ever get beyond the location guys, right, because the location guys are really like all about numbers, but if you get to the CEOs, it's really interesting how they sort of begin to have a different set of criteria. And a lot of times it is that one sort of things that idea, that romantic idea, that sort of thing that stands out. I was talking to some folks who were involved in Chattanooga, Tennessee's sort of rebirth, and talking about Volkswagen locating there. And they said it was the CEO standing on the banks of their redone riverfront where he said, "This is the place we need to be." And it was all about what Chattanooga had done to its downtown and its riverfront that persuaded him. So, look, there's no doubt it's getting tougher to figure out a winning strategy for smaller and mid-sized American cities, but I believe there is a path. There is a path, but it will take courage, it will take vision, and it will take very smart, deft strategy. It may even take making ways out of no way. That's why I think this network that you've created is so important. It's why the local public-private partnerships you're creating are so important. It's why building coalitions for change at state and local levels is so important. We need a new way of doing business to make small and mid-sized cities successful and defy the predictions of economists. And these seem to me to be the essential underpinnings. This experiment that you are engaged in changing the trajectory of cities in America is so exciting to watch. And I hope you at least can step back just a little bit and recognize the importance of what you are doing here. Because if you succeed, you are going to launch a movement among cities that will literally change the lives of millions of Americans. So please double down, get it done, not just for your cities, not just for Massachusetts, but for cities all over America. Thanks.